Okay, so the class is being recorded. This is AA100A, and this is me, Dr. Sam Abdel Galil. So what is it that we're doing today? We're doing a couple of things. We're going to start off with Plato. We're going to finish Plato off. We still have very small niceties that I would like to address myself to, and then we move on to the chapter that we're featuring today, and it is the chapter on poetry. Um, Let me share the slides, and we are on our way, inshallah. Um, see if I have them ready. Yeah, I do have them ready. This is taking too long for no obvious reasons. Okay, so this is the part that I'm telling you about. Like I said, we have done a great deal on Play 2. So what we have today is very little if you compare it to what we have already done. Um, yeah, this is the part that I would like to address myself to. Um, we're talking about the wait. Yeah, this is the part that I would like to talk about. So it's knowledge, opinion, and the status of Daedalus. I'm hopeful that I'm pronouncing the name correctly because this is Greek and I'm not um, fluent in Greek. Okay, so what is it that we're having here? We have actually talked about the difference between knowledge and opinion, and that's not mere opinion, it's true opinion in the description of Plato. Again, this is going to take us away from um, um, I mean the part that we're handling here under Lachos. It's going to take us to another dialogue by the title of Meno, where there is expansion on the idea of knowledge and what true knowledge is and what true opinion is and the difference between them. So one of the philosophical questions that interested Plato was the nature of knowledge, what knowledge means and how we can attain knowledge. He discusses this question in a number of dialogues, and we're going to explore his views on knowledge by investigating an extract from another dialogue. The dialogue that we're having is the Meno, and it was written after Lachos. So the scenario is that we don't have um, so many people around. It's only Meno and Socrates, and they are engaged in a conversation on and about knowledge. Um, so who is Meno? Meno was a rich, um, idle, and vain young aristocrat from a place by the name of Thessaly in the north of Greece. They spend much of the dialogue exploring the idea that virtue is knowledge. We have established that. Obviously, lots of things go under virtue for Socrates and for Plato. So, what is it that they are exactly discussing? They are discussing the difference between knowing that something is the case and merely having a true opinion about it. So knowing means knowledge, and having an opinion about something, this is true opinion, according to Socrates. Again, it's all about the merits of knowledge and also true opinion, and if one is, higher than the other or not, and how they help us, kind of negotiate our way through in life. Again, we will have this idea as whether we can turn true opinions into knowledge or not. Again, we're going to conclude the part by having Socrates suggesting that knowledge is more valuable than true opinion. Again, in order to drive the point home, Socrates is going to mention, or is going to refer to the mythical inventor and artist Daedalus or Daedalus. And of course, if you talk about Daedalus or Daedalus, you talk about Icarus or his son. And his son is also a mythical figure, and he is the one who created wings made of wax in order to fly. Of course, he did fly, but when he, kind of approached or came close to the sun, the waxen wings, for obvious, reasons, melted, and he, of course, kind of fell and drowned. So according to Socrates, in any particular situation, knowledge and true opinion will be equally reliable as guides. It's all about guiding, having things that you can use in order to move forward in life. Again, it's knowledge and also true opinion according to Socrates. Again, Socrates believes that true opinion can turn into knowledge, and this can happen by figuring out what makes them true, what makes those true opinions, or what makes those opinions true. In other words, knowing something involves not just believing that it is true, but also understanding why it is true. So the first point, a key idea here, in order for opinions or true opinions to become knowledge, we need to ask the question why we believe that they are true. So you'll have to give reasons as why you believe that this opinion is true. If you can establish the reasons why it is so, this kind of opinion can turn into knowledge. Again, for Socrates, knowledge is more valuable than true opinion because he believes opinions tend to stray. To stray means that they can change and they can be extreme and everything. Again, with opinion, you get influenced by other people's opinion. Again, if I'm asking the opinion of somebody about something, and he gives his opinion, and I get affected by it, somebody else may come later and also tries to convince me of his opinion. So in this case, opinion is not absolute. It's not like knowledge. Knowledge is obviously absolute according to him. It doesn't change, while opinions change. And of course, they change because people can play on our emotions. They can be tricky in giving us reasons. I mean, the reasons themselves may not be very true. They can be fake reasons. So again, that would reinforce Socrates' idea that knowledge is more valuable than true opinion, because according to him, it stays with us and it doesn't change. Again, if 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 opinion and true opinion needs understanding, needs a why, Socrates does not believe that knowledge would require that kind of understanding. At least knowing and understanding in some situations don't go together. So knowledge requires understand. The idea Socrates does not seem to think the suggestion that knowledge requires understanding applies to all kinds of knowledge. For example, he does not suggest that the man who knows the way to Larissa is obviously a city, needs to understand why the route is a good one, only that he has tested it for himself. So again, you don't obviously need to ask. Every time you are traveling to a place, you don't have to ask the driver. You don't have to know the reasons why the driver is using this way and not that one. That kind of understanding would be kind of time consuming. So the suggestion that knowledge requires understandings makes most if we apply it only to certain kinds of knowledge. So he's not totally dismissing understanding something for the knowledge to take place. He's saying that that can be exclusive and limited to certain types of knowledge. And he's giving us the example of, um, subjects like philosophy and mathematics, where it is reasonable to suppose that we can come to new things through reason and reflection. Again, he says that with other things, you don't need to ask why. So, in order to know, so obviously, like I said, knowing about something that, and not all things can be tested through this idea of understanding or why. Um, so knowledge is not something that we can absorb unthinkingly from people around us. He says that perhaps this is also another dimension that you don't, if you ask other people about knowledge and you take whatever they say at its face value, that can be very tricky and that can be very dangerous because in this case you're only mimicking. There is a great deal of mimicry. Mimicry means that you're copying what they're saying. You're not really aware of the reasons why you are doing something. You're only parroting somebody, or you're only transferring knowledge as is, and this is obviously not true all the time. So Socrates puts the point a little ruefully when he says, "I only wish wisdom were the kind of thing one could share by sitting next to someone." So if you can't just say that you're knowledgeable about something by sitting or talking to somebody. Okay, there is obviously more to knowledge than just getting the information or the knowledge from someone. Uh, so again, there is more to knowledge than just taking it from somebody. So, according to him, you cannot come to know something by parroting someone else's words, even if that person is an acknowledged expert. So he is an expert. He has the knowledge, but you are only a copier. You're only copying. Again, you cannot claim that you have knowledge by only parroting somebody else or by parroting books. If you read too much, this is again not true knowledge according to him. So it's not about having information from somebody or having knowledge from somebody, and it is also not knowledge that we're getting from books, or true knowledge, by the way. So parroting somebody else will supply you at best with a correct opinion. Knowing something involves experiencing the truth of it from yourself. Again, stressing the fact that it's not knowledge that you're getting from somebody else. This is opinion, and like we said, opinion differ and vary. So, in order for you to know something, that would require you to experience it. So you have this added element of experience. So knowing something involves experiencing the truth of it for yourself, whether that means testing out a route or working through an argument in order to understand why. So the why pops up again, and this time around it is coupled with experience. Again, the claim that knowledge cannot be picked up secondhand crops up in a number of dialogues. I mean, so the second-hand knowledge here is not knowledge; it's opinion. Second-hand, why? Because it comes from somebody else. You didn't work for it. You only took it as is, ready-made, and this is something that Plato and Aristotle are against. So it is likely that Plato believed it to be true. So if he were right, it would mean quite a radical departure from the way in which many people talk and think about knowledge. Many people would regard the testimony of other people, friends, teachers, experts, and witnesses as an important source of knowledge. But Plato seems to hold that the testimony of other people is a source only of fleeting opinion. So again, this is very dangerous. I mean, what he is saying is obviously can create problems. If, for example, some of the knowledge that you get, you have to take from other people. You cannot test it yourself. You cannot experience. If you're sick, so you need obviously knowledge about what kind of sickness you have, and this is something that you get from the doctor. Okay, but in this case, you cannot test because you're not a doctor. You cannot. You're not a physical doctor. You cannot test yourself, right? But in this case, saying that knowledge from other people is second-hand knowledge, absolute second-hand knowledge, is a little bit difficult to believe in. So, what Plato and Socrates are suggesting is that once we understand what they say, you can always apply it in retrospect to what he said about when he spoke to Lachus and Nicias. Yeah, this is basically what this part about. If you have any questions before we move to the poetry section or poetry chapter, you guys have any questions?
No.
Okay. So let's now move to the poetry part. Okay. By the way, your grades are now on the SIS. Did you check them? I mean the MTA. The MTA grades are now on the SIS. The
Yes,
SIS.
we have checked them.
Good. Okay. So reading poetry, the favorite book of beasts. So we're doing poetry, and I think I didn't do any poetry with you. So that's why a number of notions and concepts have to be explored and made clear. What's the difference, if any, between poetry and non-poetry in terms of format? I'm sure you have read enough poetry throughout your life before you come to class. So, what's the difference between a short story and a poem?
Poetry is made up of stanza, not paragraphs like a
Yeah.
short story.
Let me ask you, did we do any poetry before?
No.
No, we didn't. Oh, yeah, good. So poetry, like Toa is saying, is divided into stanzas, while non-poetry, short stories, for example, are divided into paragraphs.
I think that poetry is written in lines and it has rhymes and so on.
Yes, it is written in lines, and of course, short stories and all the other genres are written in lines. Perhaps you're referring to the length of those lines, how long those lines are. In poetry, lines are not that long.
Also,
In,
I think in poetry we have a speaker, but in a short story we have a narrator maybe.
yeah, yeah, they come with different names. Yes, you have to with in novels and short stories, you normally have what we call point of view. The point of view is the angle of vision or the perspective through which the narrative is given. That would also apply to poetry, where you normally have a voice, like you said, Yantarez. The what we call the persona of the poem. We also see the poem through its persona, somebody who through whom the poem is given. And we normally have this confusion between the poet himself and the persona of the poem. This is a common error that we all fall into. The speaker or the voice or the persona of the poem does not have to necessarily be the poet himself. Again, in terms of format, a poem is not written margin to margin. In prose and in other non-poetry formats, you have the line starting from one margin and ending in the other margin, which means that the lines are so long. In poetry, it's different. You don't have this length. You don't have this long lines. You normally have poems which are written even in the middle of the page. They are, of course, in terms of pages and also size, you would normally find that poems are very short, no matter how long they are, except for epics, for example. So for the most part, poems are short, even if they are long. You cannot compare them with short stories or novels where you may have, with novels, you may have hundreds of pages, right? So what is it that we find in poetry but is lacking in non-poetry? What is so distinctive about poetry that makes it unique?
Maybe the sound devices used,
Yeah, yes.
or the meter, for example.
You have music. They come together in order to produce music, right? So poetry is very musical, right? Songs are variation or variations on poetry, right? Aren't songs poetry in disguise, right?
Yes.
In,
Yes,
in,
they
in,
are
in
also
songs,
songs poetry.
songs, even if they are not accompanied by musical instruments, they are still songs, and you can feel the music coming out through the rhythm, the meter, and of course the rhyme at the end of the lines. So poetry is highly musical, right? Um, and poetry is also, let me ask you, instead of saying it straight, I would like to ask you, um, how's, how are you with poetry? Do you find the experience of reading and understanding poetry easy?
I think it is difficult. It is difficult to understand.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it difficult because that would be rebuffing and that would be not very encouraging because we encourage people to read poetry because it refines the senses and it elevates people, right?
I
So
think
we would
I
say,
said that it
mm,
is difficult because we don't know about the feelings of the writer or the speaker. May he
it's
say
it's it's
something that he intends something, and we are going to interpret this on ourselves, for example.
yeah, it's not that you don't know the feeling of the poet. It's only that you can come up with so many interpretations for those kinds of feelings. Poems, unlike other pieces of literature, are um, you know full of meanings. You don't have one single interpretation. It depends. It not only depends on the writer or the poet and what he or she wants to say. It also depends on you and what kind of feelings you have, what kind of mood you are in while reading the poem, what kind of backgrounds you bring to the poem itself. And we have a very interesting test here. When you read a poem, if you're 15 and then you come back to the same poem and you read it when you're 25 or 35, you're going to find the experience of reading the poem quite different. Even your interpretations are going to be different. So poems and the creation of meaning in poems does not entirely depend on the poet. The reader brings meanings, the reader brings background and sensations. Um, again, coming back to the idea of difficulty when it comes to poetry, poetry is, which is very strange, is a very highly intellectual endeavor upon the part of both the poet and the reader. The two of them would uh, exert added efforts. The poet would do that in order to make or write a poem that is so concise and that is so compact. Whatever other people say in hundreds of words, the poet has to say in a stanza or in 14 lines. So poetry is about conciseness, is about brevity, is about using the right word at the right time and at the right space. So that's why sometimes we come up with the conclusion that poetry is not for everyone. On the level of creating poetry and also on the level of understanding and appreciating poetry. Fine. So let's talk about you. You guys like poetry, and the medium or the language is irrelevant here. It doesn't have to be English poetry. So do you like poetry in general? Because poetry is universal. We have poetry in Arabic, we have poetry in English, in the Indian languages, and so on and so forth. So do you like poetry?
Yes, of course.
For me,
Yes, doctor. Yes, doctor. I like it.
You like it. Okay. What's your name?
Riyada.
Mayada. Okay. So what kind of poetry? Is it Arabic or English poetry that you're referring to?
Yeah, like Nizar Qabbani and
Zarqaddani. Amazing.
Bam.
Nice. Okay. Who else? Who else likes poetry?
I don't like poetry.
Yeah, which is fine. What's your name?
رغد.
Ragad. Why not?
I don't know. I don't understand it.
Yeah, perhaps you're lazy, a little bit lazy. You don't try to understand it. Yeah, Ragad ولا حاجة.
Just too difficult.
You don't give poets and poetry the benefit of the doubt. Do you like songs?
Yeah, a lot.
Which is, it's almost the same experience. It's a similar experience, right?
Yeah, but I don't know.
Yeah, perhaps you need or you like it when the music is explicit. Poetry is full of music, of course, but it's not as explicit as in songs, of course, right?
Some singers use poetry in songs as well. I like it when it's like sang like that.
Yes, this is what I'm saying. I'm saying that poetry and songs are brothers or
Yeah,
sisters, for that matter. You still have in songs, you still have music, you still have meter sometimes, Of course, you have rhythm, and you may have um, rhymes, right? So you need to reconsider your stance against poetry, Rabat. Try
Yeah, I kind of like Urdu poetry.
or do poetry. And you
Yeah,
speak
it's
Urdu?
no, but
Mm.
I understand a little bit.
That's interesting. Yeah. But you're not from Pakistan. I
No,
understand
no,
that
no.
you're from Egypt,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, from
So,
Egypt.
so how come you picked up Urdu? And tell us about this very interesting. Uh,
I just have friends from Pakistan and India, so I'm kind of interested in their culture and their language
Interesting. That is good.
and the songs as well. I love it.
Ah. And how far did you go with the language? Do you speak the language, Urdu?
No, I don't speak it, but I understand some words
Interesting.
from the songs, and sometimes I watch movies.
Yeah. And by the way, there is a great deal of, commonalities and similarities between Arabic and Urdu.
Yeah, yeah, a lot.
And they even say that Urdu is a combination of Arabic, Persian, you
Yes,
name it. Yes, that
yes.
that's why
There's,
it's very easy to understand. Yes. Can
yeah,
can you give us some Urdu words? Do we have people from Pakistan in class? No. Okay. India?
of words in Arabic that are the same in Urdu,
Yeah.
like um, mushkil,
Mm,
شكرية.
yes.
معاف كرو يعني معاف يعني it's like I'm sorry.
Interesting. Okay. Good. Very interesting. Um, what you're bringing to the conversation is very interesting, yeah, Ragad. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Okay. So, any other interesting insights, thoughts about poetry and what poetry does in your lives? Toka, are you into poetry?
Yes, I do. I love poetry.
Yeah. What kind of poetry? I mean, Arabic, English.
Both. I like the idea that, especially rhyming, the ones that rhymes, that their lines rhyme. I don't like poetry that doesn't have or lack a rhyme.
You mean unrhymed poetry does not appeal to you?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Interesting. But none of us is a poet. Don't we have poets in class? Don't don't you catch yourself sometimes writing poetry?
No.
Ah, anybody else? None of us. I'm sure you guys are more talented than I give you credit for. Okay. Okay. So poetry, you don't have to be a poet in order to appreciate poetry, of course. Again, like I said, poetry is different from the other genres in terms of how it looks on the page and in terms of how it also sounds, right? We're stressing the fact that poetry is highly musical. And of course, it takes a musical ear. You need to train yourself so that you can pick up the tempo and you can feel and the beat, right? Um, what else about poetry? It's in terms of ideas and themes, you have different types of poetry. You have, um, you know, poetry that would communicate personal feelings, and this is what we call lyrical poetry. You have poetry that would um, show a change of heart or attitude. This is what we call sonnet or sonnet, the sonnets and lines of, poems of 14 lines. You start off in a certain way and then you end the poem in a different mood or in a different attitude. You have poetry that lament and mourn things. Somebody dies, for example, and you write a poetry in his or in her honor. So this is called the elegy. You have what they call panegyric poetry, where the focus is on highlighting the merits of somebody. You have epic poems, and epic poems are so very long, and they are normally they have as their backdrops or backgrounds wars. They normally glorify national heroes. Every culture has, of course, its own heroes. So it is through epic poetry that we celebrate and get to know about those heroes. So these are the different types of poetry that we normally have. Um, what else about poetry before we go to the chapter? Again, like I said, poetry does not lend itself to easy interpretation. So you wouldn't read poetry the way you would read a newspaper, like we did with philosophy. Remember when we said that philosophy also is not for everyone. Philosophy is about reading and rereading and highlighting stuff. Remember how to, we had those steps on how to read um, between and beyond the lines when it comes to philosophical texts. The same would apply with poetry. It would require of you to perhaps read the poem more than once in order to kind of understand it. And saying understanding a poem is a little bit of a stretch, because normally poetry has different interpretations. So you have your own understanding and interpretation that may differ from the understanding and the interpretation of somebody else. We even in Arabic we say it. The meaning of the poem is in the stomach of the poet. like المعنى في بطن الشاعر, right? Which means that as much as hard as you try, you can still have a meaning that somebody else may disagree with. Somebody else may have a different meaning. This is perhaps what is amazing and interesting about poetry. It's the meaning is up for grabs. You come up with your own meanings. Again, that meaning would reflect your mood, your background, your knowledge and engagement with the poet himself, how much you have read of this poet, and what kind of themes he or she normally explores and introduces and addresses. Okay. So let's now move to a very interesting idea when it comes to poetry. It's the idea of whether, as a poet, you are traditional or non-traditional. Traditional poets are poets who write according to sets of practices, and those sets of practices are established. Those sets of practices have been there for hundreds of years, and people copy and follow them in order to write poetry. So this is traditional poetry. And traditional poetry is not all bad. Of course, people would like fresh things, new things. But traditional poetry is where you train to become a poet. You don't become a poet overnight or out of the blue. So you have to train, and over time you develop skills, poetic skills and abilities, and you hone them over time until you find your own voice and you start to write in your own way. So as a poet, you start traditional, and then over time you find your own voice and your own way, and it's then and only then that you can be allowed to write differently. It's exactly like singers. How do singers start? Look at any singer you may think of. You're going to find him or her starting by mimicking and imitating old singers, and then over time they start to sing their own songs. Am I correct? No.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, yes,
you're
Yes.
right.
of course.
Do you
Yeah.
mean that maybe like go to a band and then they go solo?
Yeah,
Or just
and yeah, and I'm stressing the fact that yeah, it's true. They start as a group, and then everyone creates his own
yeah.
uh, band, or where he becomes the lead singer. What I'm referring to is that normally you start off imitating other singers, old singers, right? I'm sure you're familiar with how people start singing. They start, for example, by imitating Kulthum, Abdul Halim, Muhammad Abdu, and then over time they of course when we talk about Kulthum and Muhammad Abdu, those people have very strong, very strong or very strong voices, right? So people train as how they can imitate them and copy them accurately, and this is training. And over time, when they have done enough training, they start to kind of sing their own songs. The same applies to poets. So poets, when they start, they imitate the styles and the forms and even the themes of old poets. Old poets make the body of practices that we call tradition. Okay? So, but like I said, when they get the training, it's their decision to make whether to stay within the tradition or to start something new, right? So this is what we'll be addressing ourselves to, the idea of tradition and descent. We have seen tradition and descent in other aspects. We have seen tradition and descent in philosophy, where you have Plato rejecting tradition in favor of the power of reason and the mind and everything. So we do have tradition and descent in this chapter, but it's not in philosophy like we have seen. Tradition and descent here is in poetry. So you have traditional poets, those who write traditional poetry, and they don't change. They start off traditional and they end traditional. And you also have people and poets who, of course, they have to start traditional, like they said, but somehow along the line they start to reject tradition. They start to chart their own ways. They have fresh themes, they have fresh styles, and they can even come up with their own poetic techniques. Okay, this is what the whole chapter is about. The whole chapter is about the clash between tradition and non-tradition when it comes to poetry. So if you work within tradition as a poet, you are a traditional poet. If you um, at one point decide not to follow tradition in poetry, you are a dissenting voice. Um, and of course, it's it would take perhaps time for people to understand your new kind of poetry, the themes that you're addressing, because people are so set in their old ways. For people to change their perceptions and their appreciation of things, it would take time. It doesn't work well for everyone. Dissenting from mainstream poetry is not for everyone and is not successful with everyone. Okay, everyone? Okay, so reading poetry, the favorite book of beasts. So we're going to read poetry, we're going to read some poems, and the source that we're going to read from is the favorite book of beasts. So it's a book published by a publishing house by the name of Faber, and it is full of bestial or animal poetry. You know what beasts are, right? You know what
Yes.
a beast is. So we're not doing mainstream normal poetry, and by mainstream normal poetry, of course, I mean poetry about human beings and their concerns. We're doing poetry on animals and about animals. Isn't that strange?
Yes.
Yeah, you normally expect poetry to be about human beings, about their concerns, about their issues, about their complicated relationships, and so on and so forth. But we have chosen for you a book of poetry about and on animals. So this is common. You have, of course, animal poetry. Do we have something similar in Arabic culture? Do we have poetry on and about animals? Do we have animal poetry?
No, doctor. No, I don't think so.
Are you sure? Because your no was very quick, yeah, whatever this is. Um, okay, I think, I mean, we are talking about we have that, but it's not very straightforward. Remember in old Arabic classical poetry, in the poetry of the pre-Hijra era, when you have the poet going to the remnants of the place where his lady love used to live, and he starts to lament the whole thing and feel expressing his sad feelings that she has left, or they are no longer on good terms, and then he starts to talk about his camel, right? Or
I think he's
uh,
called. There is that guy. He's called Ibn Zaydun. I think. I don't know.
yeah, Ibn Zaydun, I'm not sure that he wrote on animals or about animals, but what I know for sure is that we have this kind of animal literature. I wouldn't call it animal poetry because it wasn't written in poetry. If you're familiar with Ibn al-Muqaffa and his very famous collection of animal stories, Kalila and Dimna, Kalila wa Dimna, right?
I don't know. And the Al Mutanabbi.
Yeah, yeah, you're just dropping names, yeah. No, I'm talking about a specific type of poetry.
I'm sorry. I
It's
just
okay.
I really don't know anything.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, yeah, I can feel the excitement, and this is good. This is a very, yani good first step for you to appreciate poetry because you said that you're more into songs. I would
Yeah.
like you to give poetry the benefit of the doubt and try it. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. Anyway, so like I said, in the past, in the ancient past, in the pre-Hijra literature, Jahiliyyah, you have poets. I mean, talking about their camels, uh, but we didn't have the idea that a camel can speak, for example, and reflect on what happens around him. We only have descriptions given by the poet about their camels, which is obviously a different experience. Again, we don't have, like I said, we don't have uh, animal poetry as far as I know, and I need to check. But we do have animal literature, and of course, I gave you the case of Ibn al-Muqaffa who wrote Kalila and Dimna. I would like you to do some research on Kalila and Dimna. You're going to like it. In Kalila and Dimna, you
Isn't
have,
Kalila and
yeah,
Dimna are short stories?
yeah, this is what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying animal literature. I didn't say animal poetry.
Uh, okay.
So again, the idea is almost the same, but it is written in prose rather than verse. You have animals speaking. Of course, animals don't speak, but poets and story writers, like in Kalila and Dimna, make them speak. And speaking and speech is a function and a quality and a characteristic of human being, right? So this is personification. You're personifying those animals. You're giving them human attributes and qualities, and this is called anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is when you give an animal in a poem or in a story the attributes and the qualities and the abilities of human beings. They speak, they reflect on life, they give us things from their own perspective. They normally reflect on what human beings around them are doing. So you normally get wisdom from animals. And what is it that they are wise about? They are wise about human beings and how human beings behave. They observe human beings and human beings' behavior and start to reflect on that. In those animal literature pieces, you normally have the animals behaving like human beings. Um, Again, they may betray, they may show greed and jealousy, and there is normally a moral lesson at the end of the animal poem or the animal story. Okay, so like I said, this is old. This is an old practice. It goes as far back in time to the Greeks, where we have a poet, and we don't know whether this poet is real or mythical, by the name of Aesop. And Aesop used to write animal poetry, again reflecting through the encounters of those animals who have human attributes. They come together and they betray each other. They show jealousy. They do everything human beings do. And there is normally a moral lesson, because you normally have this idea that the good has to win at the end. Good forces have to win at the end. They have to defeat the evil forces. And that is normally the moral lesson that we get out of those stories, whether they were in poetry or in prose. Okay, so again, it's the Faber book of beasts that we're doing, like I said, and beasts are animals. And this is a collection of poems. So this is a collection of animal poems. So a collection of animal poems means that they are not written by one single poet. So you have so many poets selected in the selection, and you have so many poems in the selection. So that would prompt you to ask the question of a question that has to do with the selection. The poems are the poems in the selection the only poems in the world? Of course not. So why did the one who selected, why did he choose this poem and not that one? So if we have so many poems in a given culture, and they are all animal poems, but some of them are chosen in the selection and some others are not, we have the right to ask why. We go to the one who collected the poems, and by the way, that this collection of poems by different poets is called an anthology. So an anthology is a collection of poems written by different poets. And if they are written by different poets, you have to have, the editor of the selection. What do we call this selection? We call it anthology. And what do we call the one who collects and chooses? We call him an anthologist. Again, we need to ask why he has chosen a certain poem and left another poem, right? So does it have criteria? Does he follow a certain set of criteria as why he chose this poem and not that one? Yes, there is or there are criteria, because criteria is plural. And this set of criteria is normally known by everybody. Uh, so sometimes the anthologist has to write a preface or an introduction explaining why he chose this poet over that one. Or sometimes we, because we are familiar with anthologies and how they are produced, we don't ask. But in our case, we are asking so many questions about this anthology, because unlike old and traditional anthologies, this anthology is not, for example, chronological, where you start with old poets and then you move on to new ones. No, we don't have that. And this is obviously uh, um, running counter to tradition. This is obviously not following tradition when it comes to anthology making. Again, the editor owes it to us to explain why he is not following traditional practices when it comes to creating and compiling anthologies. Okay, so again, we're talking about tradition and descent in poetry, and we're talking also about tradition and descent in anthology making. Again, like I said, when we talk about tradition, we talk about, sets of practices. And this time around, the sets of practices that we're talking about are poetic sets of practices. And the idea of descent here is that some poets will decide not to write poetry the traditional way. And this is where the element of descent is here. We're going to start off with traditional poets, and then we're going to end with a dissenting poet, a poet who does not write poetry the traditional way, a poet who is known as a dissenting voice when it comes to poetry. And this poet is called D.H. Lawrence, as we're going to see. Okay, we're going to have, from the anthology, of course, we're going to have 3 poems. One by a poet by the name of William Blake, The Fly. The second one is by John Donne, and it's called The Flea. And a third one that is also called The Fly by Mersulov Holub. I would like you to reflect on the names of those poets: William Blake, John Donne, and Miroslav Holub. And if you think there is something that we can notice or observe about them from the names. William Blake.
They are speaking about insects.
No, I didn't talk about the titles of the poems yet. I'm focusing on the names of the poets.
Oh.
Any observations? Anything you find strange or not common about the names? Hmm. Um, I would like you to look at the third name, Miroslav Holub. Is it as similar? Is it similar to the other names? William Blake, John Donne, Miroslav Holub.
Maybe no.
No, right?
Yes.
Yeah, William Blake and John Donne. These are English names, right?
Oh,
Anglo,
yes.
yeah, I would say Anglo-American names, English names. How about Miroslav Holub? Is it an English name? And it's like saying William Blake, John Donne, Samih Abdel Jalil. So is Samih Abdel Jalil an English name?
No.
No.
No, of course.
Oh, okay. So it's the same thing. So Miroslav Holub is not an English name, which means that uh, his poetry or the poem that we have is not an English poem, right? Yeah, it's not an English poem. Yes. So how, if it's not English, how is it presented to us here? Because obviously this is English. This is an English course. So Miroslav Holub can be from where? Let me ask you. Can he be from the Arab world, for example?
Maybe
No.
Spain.
Yeah, he can be from
Russia?
Spain, Russia,
Yeah.
Eastern Europe in general. Okay, so do we expect The Fly to be written in Russian? So do we know Russian, Aslan?
No.
No.
Uh, so what do you think is going to happen? How
Eng-
can we read it? It's going to be translated into English, right?
Yes.
Okay, and that would bring us to the idea of translating poetry. Do you think poetry can easily be translated from one language to another? Is poetry translatable in the first place?
I
No.
think it is no.
Difficult,
yes, if
right?
somebody has a meaning.
It can be translated, but it takes a lot of effort because they need to choose between either revealing the meaning or the structure.
It's
Yeah,
not going to be
you're normally, as a translator, you're caught in the crossfire between, giving the meaning or working on the meaning or working on transferring the structure. Yeah, it's a real problem, right? It's a real challenge. I wouldn't call it a problem. It's a challenge.
Also, I think the translator is going to face a difficult if he doesn't have or know about the cultural differences.
Yeah, yeah, that's an aspect. Yeah, yes.
my Pakistani friends are interested in Arabic poetry, and they always send me some poetry verses and ask me to translate it, and I don't even understand it. So I just like
Mm.
try to understand for them.
Yeah, but you try to kind of, you try to transfer the meaning, right?
Yeah,
But not the structure, right? Because the structure is going to be very exclusive to the culture in which the poem or the song was written.
yeah, exactly.
So uh, let's agree that when translating poetry, something is missing, right? It's a totally different experience. That's why, in order to appreciate the poetry of a given poet, they ask you to learn the language, right? So that you can feel the feel and everything, right? So again, this is one of the things that we need to think about. This is going to be a translated poem, of course. Again, the fact that we have poetry from outside the English world means that we also have a different type of anthology, right? Um, we'll talk about that more later. Again, we'll talk about the Faber Book of Beasts, and we'll have time when and where the poet is going to talk about his choice. I mean, the anthologist will talk about his choices when it comes to the poetry that he has chosen for us. And then we move on to D.H. Lawrence, who is named or labeled here as a poetic dissident. Dissident means that he is dissenting. Dissenting means that he writes differently. He does not stick to or follow the tradition of writing poetry. Okay, so what are the aims? I'm going to introduce you to the critical reading and understanding of poetry. Develop your understanding of tradition and dissent through an exploration of the meaning of these terms in relation to poetry. I'm going to help you begin to think about ways in which we read and study poetry through anthologies such as the Faber Book of Beasts. So it's all about critical reading and understanding. Critical means that you need to use your mind, you need to think twice about your choices when it comes to judging a poem and so on. So the poems that we have here, like I said, we have the 3 poems that we spoke about, together with a number of poems by D.H. Lawrence. So this chapter focuses on poetry, where concepts such as tradition and dissent have different connotations. So obviously we spoke about tradition and dissent in other areas of the book, but obviously here we're focusing on poetry. Again, like we have established at the very beginning of the poem, when we speak about poetry, we speak about the idea that poets, when they start, they are all traditionalists. You cannot become a poet in your own right unless and until you have done some training in traditional poetry. So poetry starts as an imitation, exactly like we do with music and exactly like we do with singers. They start by imitating old singers and old music, and over time they find their voice and they start to chart in their own ways. But it doesn't succeed with everyone, of course. Again, not all poets are dissenters. Most of the poets write within tradition, and some of them choose to write in their own way. And the one that we're having here, writing poetry in his own way, is D.H. Lawrence. We will have Lawrence and see how different he is. But even Lawrence, who is the most radical of poets when it comes to departing from mainstream English poetry, even him is, when you check, you find that he is also influenced by a number of poets, which means that tradition was there, even if he denies it. I would like to stop on this note because this is getting a little bit heavy and we're ending, and I would like to start with it. So when we meet again, inshallah, next week, we will finish off the chapter on poetry, so that we can start the last chapter. The last chapter is going to be on and about English Christianity. So if you have any questions before we call it a day, go ahead.
Doctor, do we have to memorize these, like the poetry and the explanation?
No, we don't memorize stuff here. We understand. And of course, you don't memorize poems. If you mean memorizing poems, no, you don't. You don't have to.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Doctor, is there no way to review the midterm?
What do you mean by review?
Yeah, to see the the multiple choice, what you got right, and the essay again.
It would be very difficult, to kind of tell everybody where he or she went wrong, because it's a database where questions are different. And it's a long exam where you have objective parts and you also have an essay.
Do you remember my essay? Because I want to know what I did wrong, what I did right.
Of course, I don't remember your essay, Abdelmas.
Oh.
Unless it is superb. Was it superb?
No.
I'll check and get back to you, inshallah.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Any questions, concerns?
Doctor, when we can see our degree for midterm exam?
First of all, it's we don't call it a degree, Rawan. We call it a mark or grade. Your MTA grade is on the SIS. And
Okay, thank you.
Your quiz 1 mark is also on the LMS. And you have quiz 2 coming up on Wednesday at 9 o'clock p.m., right?
Is there when
Yes.
got the full mark?
What? Excuse me?
The full mark.
Malha full mark.
I ask if there is one student, or maybe they got the.
I don't ask. I just mark stuff. I have 3 courses and I have lots of students. I don't remember seeing a 25 out of 25 student. Anyway, I have to stop on this note and with this item. And I'll see you inshallah next week. Assalamu alaikum.
عليكم السلام. Thanks, doctor.